The wind came without warning on the seventh night, the way the worst things always do. It did not build. It did not announce itself with a distant howl or a shift in pressure that a man might feel in his knees. It simply arrived all at once, as though some enormous door had been flung open at the top of the world, and everything cold and dark and merciless had come pouring through. Sheriff Boyd Kinney had been walking for 3 hours. He moved through Harlow Creek the way a man moves through a place he no longer recognizes, though he had lived here his entire life. The storefronts he had passed 1,000 times were buried now beneath drifts that reached the lower windowsills. The street itself had ceased to exist. There was only white and wind and the occasional dark shape of a building pressing through the storm like a shipwreck half submerged. He had come from the Aldridge house. Old Warren Aldridge, 78 years old, who had trapped beaver along the creek before Kinney was born, lay on his bed under every blanket the house contained. His fireplace had been cold for at least 2 days. Kinney could tell by the way the ash had settled, by the frost that had crept across the inside of the single window, by the particular stillness of the air in that room that was different from the stillness of sleep. He had covered the old man with his own coat. He didn't know if it would matter. He did not have a single piece of dry wood to leave behind. That was the truth of it. That was what Sheriff Boyd Kinney, 20 years a lawman in Harlow Creek, Montana, could not outrun or outthink or arrest his way around. There was no dry wood left in this town. The stacks that families had built up through October, those proud towers of split timber they had pointed to with satisfaction before the snows came, were buried under 8 feet of frozen pack. What little people had managed to dig out was green or wet or both, and it burned the way wet things burn, giving more smoke than heat, more frustration than warmth. He had watched Constance Mercer's husband carry a dining chair out to the fireplace that afternoon. He had seen the Gable children huddled together in a single bed, their breath visible in the air of their own bedroom. He had done the math that no man wants to do, the arithmetic of cold and time and bodies. And the numbers had come out wrong every single time. He turned onto the road that ran along the eastern edge of town, and he stopped. He stopped because of smoke. Not the pale, thin, apologetic wisps that rose from the other chimneys of Harlow Creek, gray threads that the wind tore apart before they reached 10 feet. This was different. From the small cabin at the far edge of town, the one that sat back from the road behind a line of old ponderosa pines, smoke rose in a column that was black and thick and absolutely steady. The wind that had been erasing everything else in this town seemed to part around it. Or perhaps the fire that produced it was simply too strong to be argued with. Ruth Calloway's cabin. Kinney stood in the storm and looked at that smoke for a long moment. He had been to that cabin 6 months ago on an errand he had told himself was about public safety. He had stood at the edge of a hole in the ground and delivered a piece of paper to a 62-year-old widow and told her in the gentlest terms he could manage that she might want to reconsider what she was doing. He had thought she was grieving in a way that had curdled into something strange. Standing in the storm now, watching that column of smoke hold itself against the wind like a declaration, Boyd Kinney began to think something he did not yet have the courage to put into words. He began to walk toward the light. 7 months earlier, in the middle of a Montana spring that smelled of pine resin and snowmelt and mud, Ruth Calloway stood in front of what remained of her winter woodpile and tried to keep her face still. There was not much to keep still about. The pile was a small, sad collection of half-rotted logs, a few pieces of bark, and 2 chunks of wood so green they had already begun to sprout a fuzz of white mold along their undersides. This was what was left after a winter that had taken more than its share, a winter that had taken Henry. She didn't think about Henry directly. She had found in the 4 months since March that thinking about him directly was like looking at the sun. You could do it for a moment, but it cost you, and it left marks behind your eyes that made everything else harder to see. So she looked at the woodpile instead, and she thought about numbers. 24 logs at most. Enough for perhaps 3 weeks of serious cold, assuming nothing went wrong with the fire. Assuming the logs were dry enough to burn properly, which several of them clearly were not. She was 62 years old. She was alone in a cabin 12 miles from the nearest town of any size, and she had to get through a Montana winter. Her body was not the instrument it had been at 30 or even 50, but it was not a fragile one either. 40 years of ranch work had built something into her bones and tendons that did not leave simply because the calendar said it should. Her hands were rough and capable. Her back ached in the mornings and loosened by noon. She had buried a husband, outlived 2 miscarriages, survived a fever in the winter of 1897 that took 3 other women in the valley. And she had done all of it on this land, in this cabin, with the mountains to the north and the creek running south, and the particular silence of Montana pressing in from every direction. Henry had been the kind of man who filled that silence without disturbing it. He had been a carpenter and a sometime rancher, a man whose hands were wide across the knuckles, who had a habit when he was concentrating of pressing the tips of his fingers together in a particular way that she had watched 10,000 times and never tired of watching. He had been on the North Ridge Trail in March, a trail he took regularly, a trail everyone in the valley knew. The snowpack was unstable. 3 men told him so. Henry Calloway, 64 years old with knees that no longer climbed the way they once did, had gone up anyway because the fence line on the upper pasture needed checking, and because he had always checked it himself, and because he was, in the end, a man who could not accept that the things his body had always done were now things his body might refuse. The rock fall had been fast. 3 men survived. Henry did not. She had been told it was very quick. She had accepted this the way you accept things people tell you to help you bear them without knowing if it was true. Her mother's voice came from behind her. It is not enough. Edna Pruitt came to stand beside her daughter. She was 81 years old, and the decades showed in the deep lines of her face and the way she held one hand slightly curved, even when she was not holding anything. An old injury from a farm accident that had never healed quite right. But her eyes were the same as they had always been, dark and clear and focused with an intensity that made people feel when she looked at them that she was reading something written on the inside of their skull. She did not say, "Poor dear," or "We will manage somehow." She looked at the woodpile the same way Ruth looked at it, with the direct, unsentimental gaze of someone assessing a practical problem. "The almanac," she said. "The woolly bears this year have coats I have not seen in 60 years. The squirrels along the North Ridge started caching 3 weeks early. The pressure has been dropping in the way my father taught me to read it." She paused. "This winter will not be kind to anyone who is not ready for it." "Then we will cut what we can," Ruth said. "It is all we can do. It is all we can." Edna was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed the way a river changes when it nears something deep. Cutting is only half of it. The wood must be dry, truly dry. Green wood is a kind of cruelty. It promises heat and delivers smoke. She looked out toward the tree line to the north, and her expression shifted into something Ruth could not quite read. "My father knew how to solve this. He never went into a winter afraid." Ruth had heard pieces of this before, fragments, a name dropped and then carefully not elaborated upon. She had always sensed a boundary there, the way you sense a fence in the dark before you walk into it. "Your grandfather," Edna said. "Ezra Pruitt." Ruth waited. "He built something here on this property before you were born. Before I married your father and left this land. A tunnel underground, lined with timber, with shelves built into the walls, and small shafts cut up to the surface to let the damp air out." Edna's voice was steady, but something behind it was not. The earth holds a constant temperature. The moisture in green wood is drawn out slowly, more completely than any amount of summer sun could manage. After 4 months, the wood inside that tunnel was as dry as it will ever be, and it was protected from the snow on top of it. Ruth looked at the ground beside the cabin. The roots of the old ponderosa pines wound through the soil in every direction, thick as a man's wrist. "That is an enormous amount of work," she said carefully. "For 2 people. One of them 81 years old. Yes. It would take most of the summer. And you were telling me your father built one of these himself, with his own hands." Edna said it the way you say something that was once a source of pride and has since become a source of pain, with a weight on it that makes the words arrive more slowly than they should. He said the world gives you what you need to survive, but it rarely makes it easy to reach. Ruth looked at her own hands. The palms were already rough from farm work, the fingertips calloused. But there was a difference between the hands that mended fences and tended a kitchen garden and the hands that dug 50 feet of tunnel through Montana clay and root-threaded earth. "Mother," she said, "why have you never told me this before? Why have I never heard his name spoken in this house the way a man's name should be spoken?" The question had come out before she thought about it, pulled up by something in the way Edna had said his name, with the particular weight of a word that had been carefully placed on a shelf and not touched for a very long time. Edna did not answer right away. She looked out toward the northern tree line, and the silence stretched long enough that Ruth began to think she had crossed a line she had not known was there. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was the voice of a woman who had decided after nearly 70 years that the time for this particular silence was over. "He built his tunnel in 1839, Edna said, and it worked exactly as he said it would. The winter of 1841 was the worst anyone in this valley had seen. Our neighbors burned their furniture. We had a fire through every cold night of that winter." She stopped, and then someone told the county authority that the tunnel was a hiding place for smuggled goods. There was no evidence because there was nothing to find, but there did not need to be evidence. There needed only to be the accusation and the right person making it. What happened to him? He was called a danger to the community. He was pressured to leave. He went to Billings. Edna's voice did not break, but it flattened the way a road flattens when it crosses something hard underneath. He died there in 1843. I was 14 years old. Ruth stood very still. The wind moved through the ponderosa pines above them and made a sound like something breathing. Who made the accusation? Edna looked at her daughter. "I have my suspicions. I have held them for nearly 70 years without proof. We will dig first. That answer can wait." There was something in the way she said it, a kind of deliberate containment that told Ruth this was not avoidance. It was a choice that had cost something to maintain, and that Edna had made anyway for reasons Ruth did not yet fully understand. But there was also something else beneath the containment, something Ruth had not heard in her mother's voice before. Fear. Not fear of the work or fear of the winter, fear that what had happened to Ezra Pruitt would happen again. That the ground would open and swallow another person she loved. That history was not something you survived, but something that circled back and found you a second time in the same place. "Show me where to begin," Ruth said. The work started the next morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The ground fought her from the first stroke. The upper layer of soil was soft enough, thawed and crumbly with spring moisture, but 6 inches down the real Montana earth revealed itself. Dense clay packed around river stones and the thick iron-hard roots of trees that had been growing here for 100 years. The roots did not yield to the blade of a pickaxe. They had to be found, traced, and cut through individually with a hand axe, each one a separate negotiation with the ground. Ruth's shoulders began to ache on the first afternoon. By the third day, the ache had settled into something more permanent. A deep soreness that lived below the surface of the muscle and did not fully release even at night. Her hands blistered, healed to callus, blistered again in new places. She had expected this. What she had not expected was how the work would settle into her mind, how the rhythm of the pickaxe would become a kind of language. Each stroke a word in a conversation with the earth that had no end and no resolution, only the slow accumulation of understanding. Edna sat on a section of fallen log near the edge of the work and sharpened blades. She kept 2 buckets of cold water nearby. She watched the angle of the sun and told Ruth when to stop for water, when the day was hot enough to demand a rest. She could not swing the pickaxe. Her hands could not grip with the force that the work required. But she was the reason the pickaxe kept moving. And Ruth came to understand this over the first week, the way you come to understand anything essential. Not through explanation, but through observation. "Do not fight the stone," Edna said one morning, watching Ruth drive the point of the pick into a piece of granite the size of a loaf of bread. "Persuade it. Find the grain and work with it. Stone does not have a grain. Everything has a grain. You will find it. She did eventually. Not that day, but 2 days later, when she came at the same type of rock from a different angle and felt it split along a seam she had not been able to see. The stone fell apart in her hands, and she looked at the two halves of it and understood something she could not have learned from being told. That resistance is not the same as impossibility. That the difference between the two is patience and the willingness to change your angle. But there were moments Edna did not stay on the log. On the fourth morning, Ruth looked up from the trench and saw her mother standing at the edge, staring down into the deepening hole with an expression Ruth had never seen on her face. It was not pride or encouragement or the steady calm she had maintained since the first shovelful of earth. It was something older. Something that looked like the face of a 14-year-old girl, watching her father walk away down a road he would never come back from. Edna turned without a word and went inside the cabin. Ruth heard something through the closed door, not quite crying, not quite prayer. Something between the two that had no name because it had been held silent for too long to fit neatly into either category. Ruth did not follow her. She went back to digging. When Edna returned 20 minutes later, her eyes were dry and her back was straight, and she picked up the whetstone and began sharpening the hand axe with long, steady strokes. Neither of them spoke about it. But Ruth understood then that this project was not only about wood and winter, it was about finishing something that had been interrupted nearly 70 years ago by a man with a lie and the power to make it stick. And the woman sitting on that log was not only her mother, she was the daughter of Ezra Pruitt, and she was terrified. The neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. The first wagon slowed out of curiosity. Then they slowed out of the particular fascination people have for watching someone do something that appears to be a mistake. By the third week, Ruth had the sense that her project had become a topic of discussion in places she was not present, and that the discussion was not charitable. The first man to say so directly was Vernon Hadley. He came on a Tuesday, the 4th week of June, his wagon raising a small cloud of dust on the dry road. He was a large man, broad across the chest, with the particular confidence of someone who had been right about things professionally for a long time. He ran the largest lumber operation in the county and had done so for 30 years. He had opinions about wood the way a priest has opinions about scripture. They were not opinions, they were facts, and they were not open to revision. He did not get down from the wagon. He looked down into the trench where Ruth was working, his thick forearms resting on the side rail. "Calloway," he said, not Mrs. Calloway, just the surname, the way you address someone you do not consider your equal. Ruth looked up, squinting against the afternoon light. Sweat had darkened the collar of her shirt and her arms were streaked with clay. She was 62 years old, and she was standing in a hole she had dug with her own hands, and she did not look away from the man above her. "You are digging a cellar," he said. It was not a question. To store and dry firewood. Something moved across Vernon Hadley's face. It might have been amusement, or it might have been pity. With certain kinds of men, the two expressions are nearly identical. "Wood needs air," he said. "Wood needs sun. You stack it high. You leave gaps for the wind to pass through. And after 6 months, you have firewood. You bury it in a hole in the ground, and you know what you have after 6 months." He shook his head. "Rot, mold, a hole full of ruined wood and wasted work. I have been in the timber business for 30 years. I'm telling you this as a fact." Ruth held his gaze. "Appreciate the advice." She went back to digging. Vernon Hadley sat for a moment in silence. She could feel his presence up there, the particular weight of a man who is not accustomed to being answered with 2 words and a turned back. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was quieter, less performative, and because of that, more dangerous. Henry died because he would not admit he had gotten old. That trail on the North Ridge in March when everyone told him the snowpack would not hold a man his age. He paused. "Do not make the same mistake, Calloway. The ground does not care how stubborn you are." Ruth's hands tightened on the handle of the pickaxe. She didn't look up. She drove the point into the earth and levered a chunk of clay loose and dropped it into the bucket. She heard him shake the reins. She heard the wagon move away. She kept digging. Only when the sound of the wheels had faded completely did she stop. She stood in the trench with her hands around the pickaxe handle and her eyes on the wall of clay in front of her, and she breathed slowly, and she waited for the thing that was moving through her chest to settle somewhere it could be managed. It did not settle. It sat in her sternum like a stone that had found its grain but refused to split, and she stood there with it for a long time. She had almost said something back, almost thrown the words at him the way you throw a thing that is too hot to hold. But she had swallowed them, because she had learned over 62 years that words spoken in anger do not land where you aim them. They scatter. They hit things you did not intend to damage, and they cannot be taken back. Edna had heard every word. She said nothing for a long while. Then, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, she said something that Ruth would carry with her through everything that came after. He is more afraid of being wrong than he is interested in being right. That is the most dangerous kind of man. He will not stop at words. 3 days after Vernon Hadley's visit, Constance Mercer arrived with a loaf of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, dressed well even for a Tuesday afternoon call, and she had the kind of face that could arrange itself into an expression of warm concern with the same ease that other women arrange flowers. She was the wife of the town mayor, a position that gave her access to a particular kind of social currency that she spent freely and without apology. She looked down into the trench. She made a sound of gentle distress. "Oh, Ruth," she said, "you poor dear. Grief does such strange things to us." She held out the bread. "You should come to the sewing circle on Thursdays. There are good people there, people who would look after you." A pause, perfectly timed. "You are not so old that the world has nothing left to offer you, you know. There are comforts in community that a woman alone cannot provide for herself." Ruth climbed out of the trench. She accepted the bread. She set it down on the section of log where Edna sat. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, keeping her voice entirely even, "I want to ask you something directly. Are you here because you are worried about me, or because it makes you uncomfortable to drive past this cabin and see what I'm doing?" Constance Mercer blinked. It was a small disruption in the surface, quickly smoothed over, but Ruth had seen it, the flinch of a woman who had come prepared for gratitude and found something else instead. "I am here because I care about you." "Of course. Then you will be glad to know that I am well." Ruth said it the way you close a gate, firmly and without looking back. "Thank you for the bread." Constance left with her back very straight. She did not look back. The wagon kicked a small trail of dust behind it as it reached the road, and the dust hung in the still air for a long time after the wagon had gone. The way certain visits hang in the air of a place, not because they mattered, but because the person who came intended them to. It was later that same afternoon, while Ruth was back in the trench and the light was angling low and golden through the pines, that she became aware of someone watching. She had seen the girl before, at the edge of her peripheral vision, without paying much attention. A small figure, dark-haired, standing at the far edge of the property near the fence line. But now she stopped and looked directly, and the girl did not run. She was perhaps 14, wearing a blue dress, and she was holding a small notebook. She was not watching the way people watch when they are trying to satisfy curiosity or gather material for gossip. She was watching the way someone watches when they are trying to understand a mechanism. Her pencil moved across the page without her looking at it. Ruth held the girl's gaze for a moment, then she went back to work. She did not yet know the girl's name. She did not yet know that Lily Hadley, granddaughter of Vernon Hadley, had been coming 3 times a week for 11 days, and that the notebook she carried contained 14 pages of observations, measurements, and questions that her grandfather had told her she had no business asking. The weeks accumulated. The trench deepened. The town of Harlow Creek made its collective judgment, and then, having made it, largely looked away. What people tend to forget is that the looking away is its own kind of verdict. It says, we have decided what this is, and we do not need to watch it fail. It says the outcome is predetermined, and the only question is how long the person in the hole will take to arrive at it. Ruth felt their looking away the same way she felt the clay beneath her pickaxe, as a weight that was real and constant, and that had to be moved through rather than argued with. Then there was the matter of the lumberman and the paper. It came on a Monday morning, 3.5 weeks after Ruth had started digging, delivered by Sheriff Boyd Kinney himself. He took off his hat when she opened the door. He held the folded paper in both hands, and he did not quite meet her eyes. It was an official document, signed by Mayor Mercer, citing community safety concerns. The unguarded excavation posed a hazard to pedestrians and passers-by. Ruth Calloway was directed to fill the excavation within 10 days or face a fine. Kinney stood on her porch and looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I know this is not a good time," he said. "Who requested this, Boyd?" She had known him long enough to use his first name, though she almost never had. The use of it now was deliberate. It moved the conversation from official business to the territory of two people who had known each other for decades, and in that territory, certain kinds of evasion become harder to maintain. It went through the mayor's office. "I am asking who requested it." A pause. There were concerns raised by several community members. "Vernon Hadley raised them," Ruth said. "And Constance Mercer's husband signed the paper because Vernon Hadley asked him to. And his wife is still annoyed with me from last week." She looked at the document again. Her eyes moved across the language the way they moved across the clay in the trench, looking for the seam, looking for the grain. "Does this order say anything about fencing?" Kinney took the paper back and read it more carefully than he probably wanted to. "No." "Then I will have fencing up by the end of the week. Is there anything in this document that prevents me from continuing to dig a properly fenced excavation?" Another pause, longer this time. She could see him thinking. She could see the two things pulling at him, the duty that said deliver the paper and the instinct that said this paper should not have been written. "No," he said, "there isn't. Then I thank you for delivering it." She held the door open. "Was there anything else?" Kinney put his hat back on. He turned to go. Then he stopped, his back to her, his hand on the porch railing. "Ruth," he said, "you are playing a dangerous game with Vernon Hadley. I'm digging a hole to get through the winter, Boyd. It is not a game." He walked away across the yard, his boots leaving tracks in the soft earth. She watched him until he reached the road. He moved the way men move when they know they have done the thing that was asked of them, and they are not certain it was the right thing. When she turned back to the cabin, Edna was standing in the doorway. She had heard all of it. She had heard Vernon Hadley 3 weeks ago and Constance Mercer, and now this. She had sat on her log and sharpened blades and said the things that needed saying at the right moments, and nothing else. Ruth went inside. She put the document on the table and she looked at it. She sat down in the chair at the kitchen table and she looked at it for a long time. The cabin was quiet. The light through the window was the color of late afternoon, amber and heavy, and it fell across the paper in a way that made the official seal at the bottom look almost golden. She did not light the lamp when the room grew dark. She sat in the chair, and she looked at the paper, and she let the question she had been holding at arm's length since June finally come close enough to touch. What if they are right? Not Vernon Hadley, not Constance Mercer, not Boyd Kinney. They were wrong about the tunnel. She knew they were wrong about the tunnel the way she knew the creek ran south and the mountains stood north, not because someone had told her, but because the knowledge was structural, built into the foundation of what she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from her father, who had built it with his own hands. But what if they were right about her? What if a 62-year-old woman with a bad back and calloused hands and a grief she had not yet finished carrying was not the person to do this work? What if the thing she was building was not a tunnel, but a monument to the same stubbornness that had sent Henry up the North Ridge in March? What if Vernon Hadley, cruel as he was, had seen something true? She sat in the dark with that question, and she did not move, and she did not light the lamp, and she did not go outside to check the trench the way she did every evening. She sat, and she let the doubt fill the room the way cold fills a room when the fire goes out, slowly and completely and from every direction. Edna found her there. The old woman did not turn on the lamp either. She came into the kitchen in the dark, her feet finding the familiar path between the stove and the table without the need for light, and she stood beside her daughter, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she spoke. And when she spoke, it was not in the voice Ruth had come to expect, the steady, practical voice of weather predictions and blade sharpening and timber measurements. It was a voice that had been locked in a room for nearly 70 years and had finally broken through the door. "Do you know how my father died?" Edna said. "Not the fact of it. I told you the fact. Billings, 1843, I was 14. But do you know how?" Ruth looked up. She could not see her mother's face in the dark, but she could hear the shape of it in the voice, the way certain words carry the geography of the expression that produces them. "He died in a boarding house," Edna said, "in a city where he knew no one, in winter." The room had a stove, but the wood they gave him was green and wet, and it burned the way green wood burns, which is to say it did not burn. And the man who knew more about drying wood than anyone in this valley sat in a cold room and could not get warm because the knowledge he carried was 70 miles away in a tunnel someone else had called a crime. Her voice did not break. It went somewhere past breaking, into a territory that is quieter and harder and that only people who have carried something for decades ever reach. "That paper on the table," Edna said. "I've seen that paper before. Not the same words, not the same seal, but the same paper, the same man behind it with a different name and the same fear dressed up as authority. They gave my father a paper like that, and he read it and he left because he believed that a man who had done nothing wrong had nothing to fear from people who said he had." She put her hand on the table. Ruth could hear her fingers pressing flat against the wood. He was wrong about that. It is the only thing he was ever wrong about, and it killed him. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the walls, distantly, Ruth could hear the wind in the ponderosa pines, a sound she had heard every night of her life in this cabin, a sound Henry had heard, a sound Ezra Pruitt had heard before either of them. "Edna," Ruth said softly, her voice finding her mother's name instead of the word she usually used. "Who made the accusation against your father? You said you had suspicions. You have held them for 70 years. Tell me." And Edna, who had decided 40 years ago that the name would stay where she had put it, who had decided 60 years ago and then again at 50, and then again at 40 and at 30 and at 20 and at 10, that the name was better kept in the dark, where it could not grow into something that consumed her. Edna decided now in the dark kitchen with the paper on the table, and her daughter's doubt in the air, and the sound of the pines outside the window that the time for this particular darkness was over. "Orville Hadley," she said. The name entered the room the way a stone enters water. It displaced something. It rearranged the space around it. Ruth felt it settle into place the way pieces settle into place when you have been looking at a puzzle for a long time and someone hands you the one piece you were missing, and suddenly the picture is not a picture of what you thought it was. "Vernon Hadley's father," Ruth said. Edna's hand was still flat on the table. "Yes. He wanted the county timber contract that year. My father was his competition. Orville Hadley went to the county authority and told them the tunnel was being used to store contraband, and my father was driven from this valley and died alone in a city that didn't know his name, so that Orville Hadley could sell wood." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that occurs when something very large shifts position, when the ground beneath a story you thought you understood reveals itself to be a different kind of ground entirely. 3 generations, one act of cowardice or greed dressed up as civic concern, and a man had died in a city far from home, and his daughter had carried the weight of it for nearly 70 years. And his granddaughter was now sitting in the dark in the same cabin, looking at a piece of paper delivered by a sheriff who didn't know he was delivering it on behalf of the same family that had destroyed the man who built the first tunnel on this land. Ruth stood up. She did not turn on the lamp. She walked to the kitchen window and she looked out at the dark shape of the trench in the yard, barely visible in the starlight, a shadow in the earth that she had made with her own hands. The doubt was not gone. She was too old and too honest to pretend it had evaporated in the heat of revelation. But it had been joined by something else, something that was harder than doubt and older than anger, and that had a weight to it that she recognized because she had felt it before in other forms. On the morning after Henry died, when she had gotten out of bed and fed the animals, because the animals needed feeding, and grief does not change that. It was the knowledge that some things must be done regardless of whether the person doing them is the right person, or the strong enough person, or the young enough person. Some things must be done because they are there and you are there and there is no one else." She turned back to the dark room where her mother stood. "Then we have work to do," she said, "and the tunnel gets a fence by Friday." She went outside into the cool night air. She stood at the edge of the trench and she looked down into it. The walls were dark and the bottom was darker, and the smell of turned earth came up to meet her. The same smell that Ezra Pruitt had known when he stood in this same place 71 years ago and decided to dig. She would get the fencing wire in the morning. She would put up posts and string the wire, and she would continue digging, and she would not stop, and she would not fill the hole, and she would not give Vernon Hadley or his dead father or any piece of paper with any seal at the bottom the satisfaction of having stopped what Ezra Pruitt started. Behind her, in the cabin doorway, Edna stood with one hand on the frame. She was looking at her daughter the way a woman looks at something she has waited a very long time to see, with an expression that contained relief and fear and love, and the particular sorrow of knowing that the person you love most in the world is about to walk the same road that destroyed someone you loved before them. She did not say, "Be careful." She did not say, "I am afraid." She said in a voice that was steady again, the steadiness that comes not from calm, but from having passed through the place where calm is no longer possible. "Your grandfather started from the northwest corner. The drainage is better there. You will want to do the same." Ruth nodded. She did not look back. She stood at the edge of the trench in the dark, and she breathed the night air, and she listened to the pines, and she let the name Orville Hadley settle into the place where it would live from now on, beside the name Vernon Hadley, and beside the document on the kitchen table, and beside the memory of Henry on the North Ridge, and beside the knowledge that the winter was coming, and the woodpile was empty, and the tunnel was not yet deep enough. And in the morning, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, she was digging. The man who came without being asked arrived on a Wednesday in the middle of July, and he did not knock on the door. Ruth was 12 feet down in the main shaft when she heard the sound of a wagon stopping on the road above. She had learned over the past 6 weeks to identify visitors by sound before she saw them. There was the slow, curious crawl of someone who wanted to look, but did not want to be seen looking. There was the brief hesitation of someone who had considered stopping and then decided against it. And there was this, the deliberate stop of someone who had made a decision. The creak of a man climbing down rather than leaning over from the seat, boots on dry ground, heavy and unhurried. She kept digging. Hank Dawson appeared at the edge of the trench a few minutes later. He was carrying a length of seasoned pine board under one arm and a carpenter's measuring square in his other hand. He was 58 years old, with the lean build of a man who had spent his life working iron rather than sitting behind it. And he had the kind of face that did not waste movement on expressions it did not need. He looked down into the hole without comment. The way a man looks at a problem he has already worked out in his head. "The sidewalls are going to fail," he said. Ruth looked up. "Good morning to you too, Hank. Not a criticism, an observation." He held up the measuring square. "The clay here has a high moisture content this deep. When it dries through the summer, it will shrink along the horizontal plane. The walls will crack and push inward. You need vertical posts every 4 feet with cross bracing between them before you go any deeper." Ruth set down her pickaxe. She looked at the walls around her and she saw immediately that he was right. She had seen the hairline cracks beginning at the corners where the walls met the floor. She had told herself they were superficial. She had told herself this because telling herself otherwise would have meant stopping, and stopping was a thing she could not afford. But looking at the cracks now through the lens of what Hank Dawson had just said, she understood that she had been lying to herself the way people lie to themselves when the truth is more expensive than the falsehood, not out of ignorance, but out of need. "You've been watching for a while," she said. 3 weeks. She climbed out of the trench. She stood in front of him and let the silence sit there between them for a moment, because it deserved to sit there. 3 weeks was a long time to watch a woman dig a hole that was going to collapse on her and say nothing. 3 weeks, she said again. Hank did not look away. He did not offer an excuse. He stood there holding his measuring square and his length of pine board, and he let the accusation land where it was aimed. "I was deciding whether I was remembering correctly," he said. "I saw a tunnel like this once. Vermont, 1864. I was 12 years old. My father's neighbor built one after 2 winters that nearly killed his livestock and his children both. It worked the way your mother described." He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man stepping across a threshold he cannot step back over. "I was not certain my memory was reliable enough to risk giving you wrong information, and now you are certain. Now I have watched you long enough to know that the design is right and the execution needs help." He picked up the measuring square again. He looked at the trench, and then he looked at Ruth, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but in the way that a man's face changes when he stops calculating and starts telling the truth. "I'm also here because I have not slept well in 3 weeks." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Hank Dawson was not a man who made speeches. She had known him as a neighbor for nearly 10 years and could count the conversations they had shared on one hand. He ran his forge on the Dawson property 3 miles south. He shod horses and repaired plows and built the iron hardware that held this valley's fences and gates and barn doors together. He was a man whose hands spoke more than his mouth, and whose mouth, when it did speak, did not waste words on things it did not mean. The fact that he had just said more in 2 minutes than she had heard from him in a decade told her something about the weight he had been carrying. She stepped aside and looked at the trench below them. "The posts need to be at least 4 inches in diameter," she said, "and I want to start from the deepest point and work back toward the entrance." "That is the right order," he said. And he stepped past her and began to measure the width of the trench. Edna, from her place on the log, watched all of this without comment. When Ruth glanced at her, the old woman gave a small nod that communicated several things at once, none of which required words. Approval, caution, the particular awareness of a woman who has watched people come and go from her life long enough to know that the ones who arrive with tools in their hands are not always the ones who stay. The work changed with 2 people doing it, not because it became easy. It did not become easy, but it acquired a different character, a rhythm that 2 people can find together that is impossible to sustain alone. Hank cut and shaped the vertical posts while Ruth continued excavating. Edna sharpened blades and called out measurements and occasionally corrected the angle of a post installation with the quiet authority of someone reading from a document only she could see. They didn't talk much. That was fine. Ruth had come to distrust people who talked too much while working. Words were a way of avoiding the weight of the thing in your hands. Hank seemed to operate under the same principle. He measured and cut and fitted, and the sound of his work joined the sound of hers, and together they made a kind of music that was not beautiful but was steady and that filled the hours in a way that made them bearable. It was during the 2nd week of this arrangement that Lily Hadley came closer. Ruth had been aware of the girl for some time. She appeared 3 times a week without fail, always in the late afternoon, always with the small notebook. She stayed at the fence line or just beyond it, and she watched with that particular focused attention that Ruth had come to recognize as something different from ordinary curiosity. Ordinary curiosity looks for the interesting parts and loses interest when they are not immediately visible. What Lily did was more methodical. She watched the process. She watched the sequence of decisions. She watched the way a problem was identified and then addressed, and she wrote things down in the notebook without looking at it, her eyes remaining on the work, the way a student's eyes remain on the hands of the person teaching them even before the teaching has formally begun. On a Thursday afternoon, Ruth climbed out of the trench and found the girl standing closer than usual, perhaps 20 feet from the edge of the excavation, looking at the post Hank had installed along the near wall. The girl's pencil was still. She was not drawing. She was thinking. "Ask what you want to ask," Ruth said. Lily did not startle. She looked up from the notebook with the composure of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had already rehearsed her half of it. "How do you know where to put the ventilation shafts?" The question was precise. It was not how does the tunnel work or what is the tunnel for. It was a specific technical question about a specific design element, and it told Ruth more about the quality of Lily Hadley's watching than all 14 pages of the notebook ever could. "You angle them away from the prevailing wind," Ruth said. "In Montana, that means facing south, not north. North-facing openings in this valley get blocked by drifts within the first week of serious snow. South-facing ones stay clear because the wind pushes the snow past them instead of into them. She paused. "You have been drawing this, haven't you?" It was not a question. The girl's pencil had been moving every time Ruth looked up. Lily turned the notebook around. The drawing was remarkably precise for someone who had never been inside the trench. The proportions were close to accurate. The shelf system was indicated with dotted lines in approximately the right locations. The ventilation shafts were drawn with care, but their angle was wrong, pointing north-northeast instead of south. Ruth looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she handed it back. "Find the error," she said. Lily looked at the drawing. Then she looked at the timber posts with their south-facing orientation. Then she looked at the drawing again. Something moved behind her eyes, a piece falling into place with the particular satisfaction that comes not from being told the answer, but from finding it yourself. "My grandfather says you are going to fail," Lily said. She said it without malice, the way a person states a fact they have heard repeated often enough that they have started to question it. The repetition had worn the conviction out of it and left only the words, and the words without the conviction sounded hollow, even to the girl who spoke them. "I know what your grandfather says. He knows more about wood than anyone in the county. He knows more about cutting and selling wood than anyone in the county," Ruth said. "That is a different kind of knowledge." Lily wrote something in her notebook. Ruth could not see what. Then the girl looked up again and her expression had changed. It was more open than before, less guarded, as though the act of writing something down had given her permission to say the things she had been carrying. "My grandfather also says women do not need to understand maps." Ruth looked at her. The afternoon light was golden in the pines behind the girl, and the air smelled of turned earth and fresh-cut timber and the particular green scent of a Montana summer that would not last much longer. "What do you think?" Ruth said. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to a new page in the notebook and began drawing the ventilation shafts again, this time angling them south. "I think," she said, "that I'm teaching myself to read them anyway." Ruth looked at this 14-year-old girl with her notebook and her careful, defiant competence, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not quite hope. Something more structural than hope. The recognition that certain things continue, regardless of whether the people carrying them are acknowledged or thanked or even seen. This girl had been watching for weeks. She had been teaching herself the logic of a thing her grandfather had declared impossible. She had been building her own understanding in a notebook she could not show anyone, and she had been doing it alone. Ruth went back to work without saying anything else. Some responses are better given by continuing than by speaking. 3 days later, the earth made its argument. Ruth was working at the far end of the horizontal tunnel, the section that would eventually become the main storage chamber. Hank was 30 feet behind her, fitting a cross brace into position. The work had been going well. The walls in the brace sections held solid. The air in the tunnel was cool and still and carried the faint mineral smell of deep clay. Ruth had begun to feel the particular confidence that comes from understanding a physical problem well enough to anticipate it. From working with a material long enough that your hands know what your mind has not yet articulated. That confidence was a mistake. There was no dramatic warning, no groan of shifting earth, no shower of dirt from the ceiling. There was a low sound, almost below hearing, more felt in the chest than heard with the ears. Ruth looked up at the left wall and saw a section of it move. Not much, an inch, maybe 2, the clay face bowing inward like a cheek being pushed from behind. She had time to think with a strange clarity that this was the hidden pocket of moisture Hank had warned about in a different section. The one they had not found yet, the one that had been sitting behind 6 inches of dry-looking clay like a secret kept by the ground itself. Then the wall came down. It was not a catastrophic collapse. The bracing held the ceiling. What failed was a 6-foot section of the left wall, and it came in fast and heavy, a surge of clay and stone and embedded roots that knocked Ruth sideways and buried her legs to the knee before she could move. The weight was extraordinary. Not sharp like a blow, but comprehensive, like being held down by something that did not intend to let go. The clay packed around her legs with a density that made movement not just difficult, but architecturally impossible, as though the earth had closed its hand and was not interested in opening it again. She heard Hank shout from behind her. She heard the sound of him moving through the tunnel toward her, his boots on the packed floor, his hands scraping the walls as he came. And then underneath those sounds, underneath the ringing in her ears and the pressure in her legs and the smell of wet earth that was suddenly everywhere, she became aware of something she had not expected. She was looking up at the sky. The collapse had opened a narrow gap at the top of the wall where the clay had pulled away from the ceiling bracing, and through it she could see a piece of the Montana afternoon, blue and absolute and entirely indifferent to what was happening below it. It was perhaps 8 inches wide, that strip of skiing, a ribbon of blue in a frame of brown earth. And standing there, pinned in the dark with the weight of the ground on both legs and that strip of sky above her, Ruth Calloway did something she had not done in 8 months. She stopped holding. She had been holding since March, holding the grief at arm's length, holding the shape of her days together with the careful architecture of work and purpose, and the refusal to look directly at the thing that lived in the center of all of it. She had been holding, and the holding had cost her something she had not measured, because measuring it would have required her to stop holding, and she could not stop holding because stopping meant falling, and falling meant the end of the person she had constructed to get through this. She stopped. She thought about Henry. She thought about his hands. She thought about the way he pressed his fingertips together when he was concentrating. She thought about the trail on the North Ridge and the snowpack that 3 men had told him would not hold. She thought about what it must have been like in the last seconds, whether there was sky above him or only the coming dark, whether he knew, whether there was time to know. And then she screamed. Not for help. Hank was already coming and she could hear him, and she knew he would reach her. She screamed at the wall of clay in front of her face. She screamed at Henry for going up that trail when his knees were bad and 3 men told him not to. She screamed at the winter for coming and at the ground for falling, and at herself for thinking she could do this, for thinking that a 62-year-old woman with a dead husband and an 81-year-old mother and a hole in the ground could stand against a valley that had already destroyed the man who tried this before her. The scream was not loud. It didn't carry far. The earth absorbed it the way earth absorbs everything, without judgment and without memory. But it emptied something out of her that had been occupying space she needed. And when it was done, she was breathing hard and her throat was raw, and the strip of sky above her was still blue and still indifferent and still there. She began to dig around her own legs with her hands. Hank reached her. He assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, the way a man assesses structural failure when he has spent his life building things that must not fail, and he began working from the sides, his hands moving with a speed and precision that was not frantic but was very fast. He understood what Edna would say a moment later from above, that pulling straight up would compact the clay tighter, that the pressure had to be relieved laterally before any vertical force was applied. From above, from the mouth of the trench, Edna's voice came down. Steady, not panicked. Do not pull her straight up. The clay will compact tighter. Work from the sides first. Free the right leg before you touch the left. Ruth helped where she could, digging with her hands in the space Hank created, feeling for the give in the soil that meant she could move without making it worse. Her right leg came free first, then the left, slowly, with a sucking sound as the clay released its grip. The sound was organic and reluctant, the sound of something letting go that had not wanted to. She emerged from the tunnel leaning heavily on Hank. Her legs were bruised from knee to shin, deep bruises that would darken over the next 2 days to the color of a late-season plum. Her hands were raw. She sat on the ground at the top of the trench, and she breathed, and she looked at the sky, the whole sky now, not just the strip. And she noticed that Edna was not on her log. Edna was at the mouth of the tunnel, at the top of the ladder that led down into the trench. Her 81-year-old mother, who could not grip a pickaxe, who had not been in the trench since the digging began, was standing at the entrance with one hand on the timber frame and the other reaching down into the dark. Ruth looked at her and understood. If Hank had not come in time, Edna would have gone down. She would have climbed into that tunnel on joints that barely carried her weight across the yard, and and she would have dug with her bare hands, and it would have likely killed her. Because she had already buried her father from a distance. She was not going to bury her daughter from 10 feet away. Ruth also noticed, after a moment, that there was no one else there. The girl who had been here 3 times a week without fail, the girl who appeared every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday afternoon with her notebook, was absent. "Lily," Ruth said. "Was she here?" Hank was quiet for a half-second too long. The kind of silence that contains an answer before the words arrive. "She was at the fence when it happened," he said. "She ran to my property. That is how I knew." Ruth absorbed this. Lily Hadley, granddaughter of Vernon Hadley, had been watching when the wall came down. She had seen Ruth disappear into a cloud of clay and dust, and she had made a choice in that moment, a choice that had cost her something that a 14-year-old girl understood, even if the adults in her life pretended the cost did not exist. Coming to Hank Dawson meant her grandfather would eventually learn she had been here. There would be consequences for that in the Hadley household that Ruth could imagine clearly enough. The girl had made the choice anyway, in 3 seconds, without hesitation. That night, Edna wrapped Ruth's legs with strips of cloth soaked in cold water from the well. The bruising was deep and spreading, the kind that comes not from impact, but from compression, from being held by something stronger than yourself. Ruth sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, and she looked at the floor, and she said the things she had been carrying up from the tunnel, along with the clay and the bruises and the memory of that strip of skeety. "They are right," she said it quietly. To the floor, not to her mother. Hadley, the sheriff. Everyone who said this was too much. It almost killed me today. Edna tied the last strip. She sat back. She looked at her daughter with the expression of someone who has heard this before, not from Ruth specifically, but from the long history of people who arrive at the bottom of the hardest part and mistake it for the end. She did not speak. She picked up the loose end of cloth and folded it neatly. She put away the bucket. She moved through the evening routine with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that some things cannot be answered with words, and must instead be answered with the steady continuation of the things that hold a life together. Supper, water, the banking of a fire that had not yet been lit for the season. Ruth did not go to the trench the next morning. She stayed in the cabin. She sat in the chair, and she looked out the window at the trench opening, and she did not go to it. Her legs ached, a deep structural ache that was different from the muscle soreness of digging. This ache was a message from the ground itself, written in purple and black on her skin, and the message said, "I am stronger than you." She did not go to the trench the second morning either. Edna said nothing on the first day. She sharpened a blade that did not need sharpening. She made coffee and set it on the table near Ruth's hand, and she went outside and sat on her log and watched the empty trench, the way a woman watches a road she is expecting someone to come down. On the second day, she still said nothing. The silence between them had the quality of a held breath, of two people waiting for something to break in one direction or the other. Ruth felt the silence the way she had felt the clay around her legs, as a pressure that was neither hostile nor friendly but simply present and unyielding. On the third morning, before Ruth had gotten out of bed, Edna came to stand in the doorway of her room. The light behind her was the gray of early dawn. She was holding a cup of coffee, and her silhouette in the doorframe was the shape of a woman who had decided something in the night. "My father collapsed a wall in 1838, Edna said, the year before he built the tunnel. The section that failed was longer than yours. It took him 2 days to clear it. He told me afterward that he understood the ground better than any man who had not made that mistake, that the ground does not show you where it is weak until it breaks, and that the breaking is not the failure. The failure is refusing to go back and build the support in the place where you now know it is needed." Ruth looked at her mother, at the 81 years in her face, at the particular quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having moved through a great many things and come out the other side of them intact, if not undamaged. Edna set the coffee on the small table beside Ruth's bed. "Not because you failed," she said, "because now you know exactly where it is weak." She left the room. Ruth heard her moving through the cabin, heard the back door open and close, heard the familiar sound of the old woman settling onto her log near the trench. Ruth lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, and she drank the coffee while it was still hot. She thought about Ezra Pruitt standing in front of a collapsed wall in 1838, covered in clay, his hands raw. She thought about him going back the next day or the day after that, and building the supports that would make the tunnel that would save his family through the worst winter the valley had ever seen. She thought about the fact that he had not known any of that yet. He had not known the tunnel would work. He had not known the winter would come. He had only known that the wall had failed and that the failure had taught him something, and that the something was worth going back for. She got out of bed. She put on her boots. The bruises on her legs protested with every step, a deep throb that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She went outside into the early light. Edna was on the log. The whetstone was in her hand. She did not look up when Ruth passed her. She did not need to. The sound of boots on earth was enough. Ruth climbed down into the trench. She stood in front of the collapsed section, and she looked at it the way you look at something that has hurt you and that you have decided to understand rather than hate. The clay was still wet where it had come through. The moisture pocket Hank had warned about was visible now, a darker seam in the exposed wall face, a vein of water-heavy earth that had been invisible from the surface. She could see exactly how it had failed. She could see exactly where the supports needed to go. She picked up the pickaxe and she began to clear the debris. What happened with Hank Dawson and Vernon Hadley came 3 weeks after the collapse. The warning arrived at Hank's forge on a Monday morning, delivered not by Vernon in person, but by one of his mill workers, a man who handed Hank a folded piece of paper without making eye contact and left immediately. The man had the particular posture of someone carrying something he did not want to carry, shoulders slightly hunched, as though the paper itself had a weight that was not physical. The paper contained a list of 5 names. Every one of them was a significant customer of Hank Dawson, farmers and ranchers whose ironwork he had been doing for more than a decade. Men whose plowshares and hinges and wheel rims had come from his forge for so long that the relationship was not merely commercial but structural, part of the foundation on which his livelihood stood. Beneath the list, in Vernon Hadley's handwriting, a single sentence. These men will be finding other arrangements if the current situation continues. No threats, no raised voices, just a list and a sentence and the clear implication of what both meant. It was the kind of communication that does not need to explain itself, because the meaning lives in the space between the words and in the reputation of the man who wrote them. Hank came to the cabin the following afternoon. He didn't come to the door. He stood at the edge of the yard, at the line where the worked ground met the wilder grass, and he waited until Ruth came up from the trench. She saw his face, and she knew before he spoke. She had seen that face before. It was the face Henry had worn when the bank told them the loan would not be extended, the face of a man who has run the numbers and found them unanswerable. "I cannot continue," he said. Ruth pulled off her work gloves. She held them in both hands. The leather was stiff with dried clay, and the fingers of the gloves held the shape of her grip even with her hands removed, as though the work had been impressed into the material permanently. "I know what he did," she said. Hank looked at her. "I know what the paper said, and I know whose names were on it, and I understand exactly what it means for your business if you stay." She looked at him steadily. Hank Dawson was not a wealthy man. His forge sustained him, and not much more. The loss of 5 major customers would not be an inconvenience. It would be an ending. Vernon Hadley had not threatened Hank's comfort. He had threatened his survival. And the genius of the threat was that it required nothing of Vernon except a sentence on a piece of paper. The 5 men on the list would make their own decisions based on their own assessments of which relationship they valued more, the one with the blacksmith or the one with the lumberman. And the math of that calculation was not complicated. "I'm not going to argue with you," Ruth said. The words came out without bitterness. She had passed through bitterness in the tunnel 3 weeks ago, had screamed it into the clay wall, and what had come back was something harder and quieter that did not require other people to remain in order to sustain it. "I'm sorry," Hank said. "I know you are." He stood there for a moment as though he had expected more resistance, and the absence of it left him without anything to stand against. He had come prepared for an argument, perhaps, or for the particular kind of emotional appeal that would have made leaving harder and more justified at the same time. Ruth gave him neither. She gave him acknowledgement and release in 2 sentences, and the simplicity of it seemed to undo him more than anger would have. He nodded once. He turned and walked back down the road. Ruth watched him go. She did not feel the anger she might have expected. What she felt was something older and more familiar. The specific weight of standing in a place where you are entirely alone, where the last person who is standing with you has just made the reasonable choice, and where the work ahead is exactly the same as it was before, except that now it is only yours. She had felt this weight before, in March, in the days after Henry, in the particular silence of a cabin that had held 2 voices for 37 years, and now held 1. The weight was not unbearable, it was simply heavy, and she had learned that heavy things can be carried if you do not pretend they are light. She went back into the trench. Edna said nothing when Ruth came up at the end of the day. She had watched Hank leave from her position on the log. She sharpened the blade of the hand axe in long, steady strokes and did not speak until Ruth sat down beside her. The light was the color of late afternoon, the color that turns the Montana hills to old copper, the color that makes everything look like it has been here forever and will be here long after you are gone. He is a good man in a difficult position, Edna said finally. I know. Good men in difficult positions still leave. I know that too. They sat together in the light until Ruth stood up and went inside to make supper. The light lasted a long time on the hills, and neither of them mentioned Hank Dawson again that evening. 3 mornings later, Ruth came out at first light and found a bundle on the ground at the edge of the trench opening. A new pickaxe head, 2 replacement shovel blades, a broad-faced chisel for working the ventilation shafts, quality iron, the kind that Hank Dawson's forge produced and that no one else in the county could match. The metal had the particular blue-black finish of his best work, the finish he used for tools that he expected to last a generation. No note, no signature. Ruth crouched beside the tools for a moment. She ran her thumb across the face of the chisel. The edge was perfect. She had never felt an edge that clean. It was the work of a man who had put something into the metal that he could not put into words, and that he could not deliver in person because delivering it in person would cost him the 5 names on Vernon Hadley's list. She picked up the new pickaxe head and carried it inside to fit it to the handle. She didn't tell Edna where the tools came from. Edna didn't ask. Some things are understood by the absence of questions more clearly than they could ever be understood by answers. It was in the first week of August, while Ruth was clearing a corner of the old storage room in the back of the cabin to make space for the completed excavation tools, that she found the box. It was small, perhaps 18 inches long, made of pine that had darkened with age to the color of old honey. It was secured with a strip of leather that had dried and cracked over what must have been decades. The box had been pushed to the back of the lowest shelf, behind a collection of mason jars and a coil of wire, and the accumulated debris of a storage room that had not been properly sorted in years. Ruth almost moved it without opening it. It was light, and she assumed it contained nothing but old cloth or rusted hardware, or the kind of small, forgotten things that accumulate in the corners of houses where people have lived for a long time. What it contained was a notebook. The leather cover was soft with age. The pages inside were dense with small, precise handwriting, the kind produced by a man who had learned to write as an adult and treated each letter with the careful attention of someone who understood that letters cost something. The ink had faded to brown, but it was still entirely legible. The hand that had written it had pressed hard into the paper, as though the writer wanted to make certain that time could not erase what he had to say. Ruth opened to the first page and read the date, April 14th, 1839. She did not run. She carried the notebook outside the way you carry something that belongs to someone else, with both hands and with the awareness that the weight of it is not physical. She walked to where Edna sat on her log and held it out without speaking. Edna took it. She looked at the cover. She looked at the handwriting on the first page. And her hands, the hands that had been steady through the collapse, steady through the visits from Vernon Hadley and Constance Mercer and Boyd Kinney, steady through 67 years of carrying a dead man's memory without a single piece of physical proof that he had existed on this land. Her hands were not steady now. "This is my father's writing," she said. They read it together in the August afternoon, with the light coming through the pines and the smell of turned earth rising from the trench, and the sound of the creek running south the way it had run in 1839, when Ezra Pruitt sat somewhere near this spot and wrote the first entry. Most of it was practical: measurements, material lists, the sequence of construction decisions Ezra had made as he built the original tunnel, the depth of the main shaft, the angle of the ventilation shafts, the spacing of the shelves, the type of timber that worked best for the framing and the type that did not. It was the record of a man solving a problem methodically and completely. And Ruth read it with the particular attention of someone who has been solving the same problem and can now compare her answers with the answer key. But interspersed with the technical record was something else: a voice. Ruth could hear it even through the faded ink and the decades of distance. A man who thought carefully about what he was doing and why. A man who understood that the tunnel was not only about wood, it was about the relationship between a person and the place they lived, between the work of preparation and the reward of survival, between the solitary act of building something no one else believed in and the communal result of having built it when the time came. Near the middle of the notebook, in an entry dated December of 1841, after the great winter that had proved everything he built, Ezra had written about his neighbors, about the warmth they had, about what it meant to have prepared when preparation had seemed like foolishness to everyone around him, about the particular satisfaction, which he was careful to distinguish from pride, of knowing that his family would survive what was coming because he had done the work before it arrived. And then, in the same entry, he had written about a conversation he had overheard at the general store between two men who did not know he was behind the flour barrels. He had written one name: Orville Hadley. Not a suspicion, not an inference, a direct record of a conversation in which Orville Hadley had discussed with another man the report he intended to make to the county authority, the words he would use, the charge he would bring, and the timber contract that would come open once what he called the Pruitt nuisance was dealt with. Ezra had recorded the conversation with the precision of a man who understood that he was writing evidence, and that evidence must be exact to be useful. Ruth read the entry twice. Then she looked up at her mother. Edna was very still. She was looking at the page with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for nearly 70 years and has just been told with absolute certainty that the thing she was carrying was exactly as heavy as it always felt. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from discovery but from confirmation. It is the pain of learning that you were right all along and that being right changed nothing. That the truth you carried in silence for decades was the truth, and that the silence was not wisdom, but merely endurance. She did not hold it in. She did not maintain the composure that had carried her through the summer. She cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The tears came the way water comes through a crack in a dam, not in a rush, but in a steady flow that cannot be stopped because the pressure behind it has been building for longer than the structure was designed to hold. She cried for her father, who had died alone in Billings in a room with green wood and no warmth. She cried for the 14-year-old girl she had been when they told her he was gone. She cried for the nearly 70 years she had spent carrying the name Orville Hadley in a locked room inside her chest, afraid to open the door because she was not certain what was behind it. And now the door was open, and what was behind it was exactly what she had always known. Ruth sat beside her mother and did not touch her because some grief is so old and so deep that touch is an intrusion. She sat, and she waited, and she let her mother have the thing she had not had in nearly 70 years, the right to grieve openly in the presence of proof. When it was over, Edna wiped her face with the back of her hand. She turned the page. The entry continued. Ezra Pruitt had written, after recording Orville Hadley's name and intentions, a single additional paragraph. In it, he expressed his understanding that a man who would do what Hadley intended to do was a man governed entirely by fear. Fear of competition, fear of being outworked by someone who had less and did more with it, fear ultimately of being shown that the world was larger and more capable than his own vision of it. He had written the final sentence of that paragraph with a hand that was steadier than the rest, as though he had arrived at it after some deliberation and wanted to set it down with care. A man who must destroy what he cannot match is a man who will never know what he could have built. And then the entry ended. The last page of the notebook was what stopped Ruth's breath. It was dated February of 1843, almost certainly the final winter Ezra Pruitt spent in Billings, the city where he had been sent to die, though no one would have called it that. The handwriting was slightly less precise, as though written in cold or in fatigue or in the diminishment that comes to a man near the end of his endurance. He had been writing to someone, perhaps to Edna, perhaps to no one, perhaps only to the act of writing itself, which is sometimes the last conversation a person has when all other conversations have been taken from them. The sentence stopped at the third word of the sixth line. The paper around those last words was warped, dried into the shape of something that had been wet and then left to sit for a very long time. The notebook had been closed before the ink dried. Ruth looked at that unfinished sentence. She looked at the warped paper. She understood what had made it wet. She understood that in February of 1843 in a boarding house in Billings, a man who had built a tunnel that saved his family had sat alone in a cold room and had not been able to finish what he was writing, and that the reason he could not finish was the reason the paper was warped. And she closed the notebook carefully, the same way you close something that belongs to someone else, with care and with the awareness that you are not the person who should determine what happens to it next. She handed it back to her mother. Edna held it in both hands. She did not speak for a while. The August light was beginning to change, moving toward the longer shadows of late afternoon. A red-tailed hawk circled above the tree line in slow, patient arcs. The creek made its constant sound. He would have wanted the tunnel finished, Edna said finally. That is the only answer to what is in those pages, not anger, not confrontation. She looked at her daughter. He would have wanted the tunnel finished and the wood dry and the fire burning through the worst winter anyone could remember. That is how you answer a man like Orville Hadley. That is how you answer his grandson. Ruth nodded. She stood up. She picked up the new pickaxe, the one whose head had arrived without a note 3 mornings ago from the forge of a man who had left and could not come back, but who had found a way to stay. Then we have work to do, she said. The autumn came the way Montana autumn always comes, fast and without apology. The aspens went yellow overnight, it seemed, and the mornings carried a cold that was no longer a suggestion, but a statement. Ruth worked from first light to last, her body by now a different instrument than the one that had picked up the first shovel in May. The movements were economical. There was no wasted effort. She had learned over 5 months of this work that endurance is not about force. It is about the elimination of everything unnecessary. Every swing of the pickaxe landed where it was aimed. Every shovelful of earth went where it was needed. Her body had become a tool that was perfectly suited to its purpose, not through strength, but through repetition and refinement, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that lives in the hands and the shoulders and the back rather than in the mind. The tunnel was finished in the first week of October. The wood came next, load after load from the forest behind the property, stacked on the shelves in the careful pattern that Edna directed. Each piece separated from the next, each row set to allow the air to move between them. It took 11 days to fill the tunnel. Ruth worked alone. Edna directed from the entrance, her voice steady, her instructions precise. Her knowledge of the spacing and the angles and the proper orientation of each piece coming from a source that was older than her own memory. From the years before she was 14, when her father had shown her things he did not know she would need to remember. On the last afternoon, when the final load was in place, Ruth stood at the far end of the tunnel and looked back toward the entrance. The lantern she carried threw warm light along the packed shelves, and the smell of fresh-cut wood and dry earth was the finest smell she could imagine. It smelled like survival. It smelled like the answer to a question that had been asked in 1839 and interrupted in 1841 and carried in silence for nearly 70 years and finally spoken aloud in the language of timber and earth and work. She was aware in that moment of a presence she had not acknowledged directly. Near the entrance to the tunnel, the shelves along the lower wall were stacked in a pattern subtly different from the one Ruth had created. The spacing was slightly different. The pieces turned at an angle she had not used. It was more efficient than her own arrangement, a tighter configuration that allowed air to circulate through a smaller gap. She had noticed it 2 days ago and had not said anything. On the ground just inside the entrance, she found what she had not seen when she carried the last load in. A small blue ribbon, the color of a dress she had seen 3 times a week for the better part of a summer. Ruth picked it up and put it in her pocket. She went to the entrance and found Edna standing there in the October air. The old woman's breath was visible in the cold. Her face was set in an expression that Ruth had come to understand was not severity but concentration. The concentration of a woman who was holding the present moment with both hands because she understood that moments like this one do not come twice. Edna stepped inside the tunnel. She placed her right hand flat against the wall, against the timber planking that covered the earth, and she held it there. Then she knocked 3 times, softly. "My father did this," she said, "at every completed structure. He said the work deserved to know it was finished." Ruth placed her hand on the wall beside her mother's. She knocked 3 times. The sound was small in the tunnel, absorbed by the wood and the earth and the shelves full of timber. But it traveled. It traveled through the packed clay and the roots of the ponderosa pines, and the rock beneath the roots and the history beneath the rock. It traveled down to the place where Ezra Pruitt had put his own hand against a wall he had built 71 years ago, and had knocked 3 times and had believed, for a brief time before the world took it from him, that the work he had done would stand. They sealed the entrance that evening. When they were done, the tunnel was invisible from above. The earth showed no sign of what was underneath it. You could walk across that ground and never know that below your feet, stacked in ordered rows on shelves built into walls framed with timber and braced against the pressure of the earth itself, enough dry wood to burn for 3 weeks waited in the dark. The snow could come now. The wind and the particular relentless cold that the woolly bears and the squirrels and the almanac had been predicting since spring. Whatever was coming, whatever the sky held and the mountains sent down and the valley was forced to bear, they were ready for it. Ruth stood outside the cabin in the last light of an October afternoon and looked at the ground where the tunnel entrance had been. The grass was beginning to cover the disturbed earth. The ponderosa pines stood tall and still and ancient above her. The creek ran south. The mountains to the north were already white at the peaks. She was 62 years old. She was alone except for the woman inside the cabin who had given her everything she needed to get here. She was standing on land that her grandfather had worked and lost, and that she had worked and held. And below her feet, invisible and inviolable and ready, the work of 3 generations waited for winter. 3 weeks later, the blizzard arrived. It did not come the way winter usually arrives in Montana, with a week of warning in the sky and a gradual tightening of the air that gives a person time to prepare their mind along with their property. It came between sunset and midnight on a Wednesday in November. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. The wind came from the north, and it came with a sound that was not a howl, but a continuous roar. The sound of air moving at a velocity that strips it of personality and turns it into force. And by the time Harlow Creek woke on Thursday morning, the world had been replaced. Not transformed, replaced. The road was gone. The fences were suggestions beneath the drifts. The space between buildings had become a single continuous white mass that moved and shifted with the wind in a way that made it appear almost deliberate. The creek was invisible. The mountains to the north had disappeared behind a wall of falling snow that had no edge. It was only the storm, and the things the storm had not yet finished burying, and the shrinking distance between the two. Ruth built the first fire before sunrise. She went down through the root cellar, lifted the iron latch on the small door in the earthen wall, and stepped into the tunnel. The air inside met her the way it had met her every morning for 6 weeks. Cool. Dry, carrying the faint resinous scent of properly seasoned pine. She selected pieces from the lower shelf and carried 2 armloads up into the cabin. The wood caught in under a minute. It burned clean and immediate and without negotiation, with a heat that was substantial and steady. This was the heat of wood that had been made ready by the earth itself. The heat that Ezra Pruitt had described in his notebook. The heat that had been called a crime 70 years ago by a man who could not tolerate the success of someone he intended to replace. Ruth stood in front of the fireplace with her hands extended, feeling the warmth travel through her palms. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with a sound like something leaning. Inside, Edna made coffee. The first 2 days passed in the strange, suspended peace of being well sheltered while the world beyond the walls comes apart. The wind was a constant presence, a voice that lived in the timbers, but it could not get in. Ruth made the trip to the tunnel every 4 hours, selecting wood and carrying it up. Edna knitted by the fire and told stories about winters she had known. The winter her mother had read aloud from the same 3 books for 4 months, and by March, the family could recite entire chapters from memory. The winter, the creek froze so deep that a horse walked across it without cracking the surface. Small stories, the kind that a woman of 81 carries not because they are significant, but because they are hers. On the 3rd day, the temperature dropped into a range that ordinary language was not equipped to describe. The cabin's single window developed a second pane of frost on its interior surface, thick enough to be opaque. Ruth could see her breath in the room despite the fire. She added more wood. The fire answered, but the answer was a degree smaller than the question. That night, Ruth dreamed about Henry. The first dream she had allowed herself in 8 months. Not the rockfall, not the North Ridge. She dreamed about his hands, carpenter's hands, wide across the knuckles. He had a habit when he was concentrating of pressing the tips of his fingers together in a particular way, a private gesture she had watched more times than she could count. In the dream, his hands were working something she could not see, and the sound they made was the sound of wood being shaped by someone who understood it the way the creek understands its own bed. She woke before dawn. The fire had burned down to coals. She lay still beneath the quilt and she let herself think about Henry Calloway directly, without flinching. She thought about his face in morning light. She thought about the way he sang when he was alone in the workshop, badly, always badly, with a commitment that made the quality irrelevant. She thought about the last morning, the boots, the coat, the trail. The grief moved through her like cold water through an open hand. It did not pool. It simply moved through, and when it passed, it left behind not comfort, but a kind of clarification. She had loved him. She had been loved by him. The winter had come for him before he was ready, and it had not come for her, and she had used the time she had been given to build something that would hold. She got up and fed the fire in the dark and sat in the chair and watched the wood catch. She didn't dream again that night. On the 5th day, she noticed what was happening to the town. The small, high window on the south wall offered a narrow view across the lower valley, and what she saw through it was the progressive silencing of Harlow Creek. One by one, the chimneys had gone from their thin, struggling columns of smoke to nothing. The houses were still there, but the fires inside them were dying. The woodpiles built through October were buried under 8 feet of frozen pack. What little anyone had dug out was green or wet or both. The town was burning its furniture. Ruth knew this because she could see in the quality of the remaining smoke the difference between wood that was meant to burn and wood that was not. She counted. 11 chimneys visible from this window. 8 were cold. Edna stood beside her and looked at the same view. How much do we have left? Enough for 3 more weeks of this. If the storm does not worsen, it will worsen before it breaks, I know. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. The wood in the tunnel could keep them alive. It could also keep others alive. And the space between those two facts was the space in which a decision lived. The last time an occupant of this property had shared the contents of that tunnel with the community had used his generosity as the foundation for his destruction. Ruth turned away from the window. She went to make supper. The knock came on the 7th night. Ruth was not asleep. She had not been sleeping well since the 5th day, lying awake thinking about the houses she could see from the south window. and the houses she could not. She heard the knock through the wind and was at the door before it came a second time. Boyd Kinney stood on her porch. He was so covered in snow and ice that for a moment he was not a man but a shape, a white figure against a white world. His coat was rigid, his hat was gone. Behind him in the storm, shapes, she counted them, 7, 8, more men from town standing in the blizzard looking at her door. "Warren Aldridge," Kinney said. His voice was raw. "We cannot get him warm. We have been burning furniture for 3 days. The Gable children have fever. Dr. Carver says they need heat, real heat." He looked at her with eyes that had gone past pride into the territory that lies on the other side of it. "I do not know what you have in there, Ruth, but whatever it is, we need it." Ruth looked at him. She looked at the men behind him. She recognized faces. Mayor Mercer, 2 of Vernon Hadley's mill workers, the youngest Gable brother with frost in his hair and fear on his face. She stood in the doorway and she didn't step aside. 5 seconds. They were not 5 seconds of revenge or triumph. They were the 5 seconds in which a woman who had been told she was wrong by every voice in this valley allowed herself to feel the full weight of what it had cost her to be right. The bruises that took 3 weeks to heal. The 2 days she did not get out of bed. The scream she threw at the clay wall. The sound of Hank Dawson's boots walking away. The 70 years her mother had carried a dead man's name in silence. 5 seconds for all of that. Then from behind her, from the chair by the fire, Edna's voice came. Quiet, clear. My father would have opened it. 5 words. They were not a command. They were a statement of fact about a man who had been dead for 67 years and whose character was still the clearest voice in the room. Ezra Pruitt would have opened the tunnel immediately. He would not have counted to 5 because the wood was dry and the fire was needed, and the space between having something and sharing it was a space Ezra Pruitt had never been able to occupy. Ruth stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the wind," she said. They came in. They filled the cabin with cold and ice and the smell of men who have been outdoors in conditions that outdoors was not designed for. They stood near the fire and held out their hands and said nothing, because the warmth was speaking a language louder than anything they could have said. Kinney looked at the fire. He looked at Ruth. "How?" he said. "I prepared." She led them down through the root cellar, her lantern held high. She stopped at the small door and lifted the latch and pulled it open. The cool, dry air came out, and Kinney made a brief, involuntary sound, the sound of a man encountering something his experience had told him could not exist. The lantern light moved across the tunnel. 200 feet of shelves stacked floor to ceiling with wood that had been made ready by the patient, constant temperature of the earth. Kinney took off his glove and touched the nearest piece with bare fingers, needing to verify the dryness through his skin because his eyes were reporting something his 30 years of experience said was not possible. He looked at the scale of it, the precision, the months of work visible in every joint and post and shelf. "My God," he said quietly. The words were not amazement. They were the sound of a man measuring the distance between what he had believed and what was true. "Start with the Aldridge house," Ruth said, "and the Gables, then work outward from the coldest first. Pastor Creighton has been checking every house in town since the second day. He knows who is worst off. Listen to him." Kinney nodded. He organized the men. Groups formed. Loads were assigned. The steady movement of wood from shelves to arms to stairs began. And within 20 minutes, it had found its rhythm. Ruth went back upstairs. Edna was sitting in her chair by the fire, not upright, not attentive the way she usually sat. She was leaning slightly to one side, one hand loose in her lap, her breathing visible in the way it should not have been in a room this warm. "Mother." Edna looked up. Her eyes were clear. Whatever was diminishing in her body had not reached her eyes. "Sit down," Ruth said. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. Sit down anyway." Ruth sat beside her and took the loose hand in both of hers. Edna's fingers were cool, not cold. Cool. The difference mattered the way the difference between a crack and a break matters. "I pushed too hard in October," Edna said. "All that standing in the wind. My chest has been tight for 2 weeks. I did not tell you because there was nothing to be done about it during a blizzard. There is something to be done about it. You stop pretending you are fine, and you let me sit here with you." Edna looked at her daughter. And then the holding let go. Not with tears or collapse, with a softening. A letting go of the muscles around the jaw and the tension in the shoulders and the effort that had been keeping her breathing even. She leaned back and closed her eyes and let her hand rest in Ruth's hands and let the fire warm her. "I heard them going into the tunnel," Edna said. "My father would have done exactly this, opened it, given everything. He would not have let them ask twice. They only asked once." "Boyd Kinney is not a bad man," Edna said. "He is a man who trusted the wrong opinion." "Orville Hadley was motivated by greed," Ruth said. "Kinney was motivated by habit. They are different mistakes. You are more generous than I would have expected tonight. I'm tired. Generous and tired are sometimes the same thing." Edna made a small sound that might have been a laugh. They sat together while the men worked below, and the storm continued against the walls. Ruth did not let go of her mother's hand. Vernon Hadley arrived after midnight. Ruth heard his voice in the root cellar below, directing men with the efficiency of someone who knows how to organize labor. She met him at the root cellar door. He was different from the man who had leaned on his wagon rail in June. The certainty that had been his defining feature was absent. In its place was something more careful, the expression of a man who has decided to observe before he speaks. "Go ahead," Ruth said. He walked the length of the tunnel slowly. He evaluated the construction automatically, reading the structural elements with lifelong fluency. The posts, the cross bracing, the joinery. He stopped at the far end. On the end wall, at shoulder height, the older plank, darker than the rest, carved into its surface in careful, deliberate lettering, E. Pruitt, 1839. Vernon read them. He stood in front of that plank for a long time. The men working around them slowed, sensing something in the air that was not about wood. "Pruitt," Vernon said. His voice had a quality Ruth had not heard from him before. "That was the man your father reported to the county." "Ezra Pruitt," Ruth said. "My mother's father. He built the original tunnel on this property in 1839. He was driven out of Harlow Creek in 1841 and died in Billings 2 years later. Your father wanted the county timber contract. My grandfather was his competition." Vernon looked at the carved letters. "I told you in June that Henry died because he would not admit he had gotten old." He stopped. "That was a cruel thing to say. I said it because I needed you to stop. If you were right about this tunnel, it did not only make me wrong about wood, it made me wrong about my father. And being wrong about my father means being wrong about everything I built on what he taught me." Ruth said nothing. "I understand that does not excuse it," Vernon said. "No, it does not. What can I do tonight? Take the second crew. The Aldridge house needs the most and it is the farthest. Listen to Pastor Creighton." Vernon nodded and began organizing the men. Ruth went upstairs. Pastor Edmund Creighton came through the tunnel twice that night, taking what was needed with a nod that contained everything necessary and nothing superfluous. Constance Mercer arrived before dawn, her composure undone, her youngest child shaking in a house that had not been warm in 2 days. She looked at Ruth and said the simplest true thing she had ever said. "I came to help Carrie. Tell me what to do." Ruth told her. Constance went down and delivered instructions, and the operation reorganized around her voice, and neither woman mentioned the bread or the pity or the Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago. Hank Dawson came through the back door in the 4th hour, having walked around the cabin through the storm rather than enter through the front where people would see him. Ruth opened the door before he knocked. "Edna, is she all right? She is resting. Not in danger, but not well. Hank, the tools you left. You do not need to say anything about that. I know I do not need to. I am choosing to." She held the door open. "Come in. I need someone to keep the fire going while I manage what is happening below." He came in. He sat by the hearth and kept the fire burning through the rest of the dark hours with the same methodical competence he brought to his forge. Edna slept in her chair across from him. He did not disturb her. Ruth moved between the tunnel and the cabin for the rest of the night, directing and assessing and making the decisions that someone had to make. She was not a sheriff or a mill owner or a pastor. She was a 62-year-old widow who had spent 6 months digging a hole in the ground. And she was the person in Harlow Creek on this particular night who knew exactly where things stood. She knew the inventory. She knew the structure. She knew which shelves could be depleted and which had to remain loaded for structural integrity. She didn't feel powerful. She felt useful. The distinction mattered to her. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 9th day. It broke the way Montana storms break, suddenly and completely. The wind stopped. The snow fell straight down for 20 minutes, and then that stopped too. And the sky opened above the valley, and it was blue. The deep, pure blue of winter at altitude. The blue that exists above everything and is touched by nothing. Ruth stood outside the cabin for the first time in 9 days. The world was altered. Snow chest-deep in the open areas, over the roof lines where it had drifted. The creek buried. The mountains white from base to summit. And from the chimneys of Harlow Creek, smoke rose. Not one chimney, not some, all of them. Every chimney in the valley was producing smoke. The whole town was warming itself on wood that had spent 6 months underground being made ready for exactly this morning. The proof was written against that impossible blue sky and columns of smoke that rose straight and steady in the still air. Ruth stood in the snow and watched them, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the thing that comes after triumph when you are too tired and too honest for it. The quiet recognition that the work she had done was the right work and that it had been enough. Warren Aldridge survived. The Gable children's fevers broke on the 8th night. No one in Harlow Creek died in the storm. Edna recovered slowly in the weeks after. The tightness in her chest eased. She returned to her chair and her knitting and her weather predictions based on woolly bears and squirrel behavior, and the ache in joints that remembered storms before anyone else noticed them coming. Vernon Hadley came in February, alone. He sat at Ruth's table and placed a document on it, drawn up with the county clerk. It proposed the formal naming of the tunnel as a community resource with its origin properly recorded. "I want to name it the Pruitt-Callaway Tunnel," he said, with the county record showing who built the original design and who rebuilt it. Ruth read the document. "Why?" "Because my father erased a man's name from this valley. The least I can do is put it back." He paused. "I've also been telling people I was wrong. About the wood. About you. About the tunnel. A man's word about wood is his reputation in this business. I said things that were not true and people believed me because of who I was. That deserves public correction." Ruth signed it. The document was filed that spring. Edna lived to see 3 more winters warmed by the tunnel. She died in the spring of the 4th year, on a morning in April when the creek was running fast with snowmelt and the aspens were putting out their first leaves. She died in her chair by the fire, which was burning on wood from the tunnel below. Ruth was with her. They had talked the night before about Ezra Pruitt, about the man he had been in the years before Edna was 14, and the world took him from her. He had been, Edna said, a man who did not require validation from the people around him. He understood that certain kinds of work speak for themselves, but only to people who are present when the results arrive. The important thing was not to be acknowledged, but to have done the work. He would have been glad, Edna said that night, not proud, not vindicated, just glad. Ruth thought about this afterward. She sat in the chair that had been her mother's and she watched the fire, and she held the notebook with the faded ink and the unfinished sentence and the warped page, and she thought about what it means to complete something that someone else began. Not to rescue or restore, simply to continue. Because the work was worth continuing and you happened to be the person there to do it. Spring came hard and bright the way Montana springs do, as though making up for the winter all at once. Ruth was outside on a morning in late April, remortaring the ventilation caps, when she heard a sound from the edge of the property. Metal on earth, rhythmic, deliberate, a sound she recognized before she turned around. Lily Hadley was kneeling in the mud near the fence line. She was 15 now, her dark hair pulled back, a short-handled spade working through the spring soil with the methodical focus of someone who has been planning this for a long time. The composure she carried was more settled than it had been the previous summer, worn into her rather than placed on top of her. Beside her on the ground, open, was a notebook. The pages were filled with drawings and calculations more sophisticated than anything Ruth had seen from her before. Ruth walked over. Lily did not stop. "The drainage is different on this side of the fence," Lily said without looking up. "I need to account for that in the ventilation shaft positioning." Ruth looked at the excavation. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the girl who had watched from a fence line all summer, who had run to Hank Dawson in 3 seconds when the wall came down, who had left a blue ribbon on the floor of a tunnel she had entered in secret to stack wood in a pattern more efficient than Ruth's own. "You corrected the shaft direction," Ruth said. "In the drawing last summer. I figured it out the same afternoon you told me to find the error." Lily sat back and looked at her work with critical eyes that were her own. "I have also accounted for the higher water table on this side. The floor will need to be angled differently to manage runoff." Ruth crouched beside her. The drawing was precise. The structural annotations showed an understanding that went beyond watching. "Where did you learn to draw loads like this?" "My grandfather's engineering manuals. He has a library of them. He used to think I was reading them for interest. Now I think he knows I'm reading them for use. He has not said anything about it. That is progress." "It is something," Lily said, which was more precise. Ruth looked at the site, the slope, the soil. "You need to go 3 feet further north before you start the horizontal. The water table runs closer to the surface in this direction. If you start here, you will be in it by spring thaw. How far north? Come look at this." Ruth walked to a point she identified by the composition of the visible soil. "Here. The composition changes in about 6 inches. When it changes, that is your starting point." Lily came. She pressed her fingers into the earth the way Ruth had done, reading the ground through her hands. She wrote in the notebook without looking at it. "Will you show me the rest?" Lily said. "Not help me. Show me." "Yes," Ruth said. They worked through the morning. Ruth showed and Lily did. When Lily made a mistake, Ruth pointed to it and waited, the way Edna had done. Because that was how the knowledge went deepest, not through instruction, but through discovery, not through being told, but through being shown the territory and trusted to navigate it yourself. At noon, Vernon Hadley came. He stood at the fence line and looked at the two of them working in the turned earth. He didn't call out or demand. He stood for a moment in the way of a man watching something he didn't expect and is not yet sure what to think of. Then he nodded once in Ruth's direction. She returned the nod. He went away. Lily watched him go. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines. The creek ran south. "My grandmother told me once," Lily said, "that the worst thing you can inherit from your father is his conclusions, that you should take his methods and reach your own." She picked up her spade. "I think about that a lot. Your grandmother sounds like a woman worth listening to." She was. She died when I was 8. I still think about what she said. They went back to work. The sound of their spades in the spring earth was steady and rhythmic, and it carried across the property and into the pines and down toward the creek that ran south the way it had run when Ezra Pruitt first heard it. 71 years before a girl with a notebook and a spade and her own questions knelt in the mud and began to dig. The tunnel Lily Hadley built that summer was smaller than the Pruitt-Callaway. First efforts always are. But it was well made and correctly sited, and it served her family through 3 winters without failure. She improved it the second year, added a 3rd shelf tier that increased capacity without changing the footprint, adjusted the ventilation geometry in a way that Ruth, when she saw it, had not thought of herself. The Pruitt-Callaway tunnel served Harlow Creek for 37 years. It was expanded twice, in 1913 and again in 1923, and both expansions followed the original structural principles because the principles were sound. The carved plank bearing the words E. Pruitt, 1839, remained on the end wall through both expansions, dark, clear, permanent. When the tunnel was finally decommissioned in 1947, as the valley converted to centralized heating, the decision was made to preserve that section of wall in place. The county historical record notes that this preservation was requested by the tunnel's then custodian, a woman of 51 with 2 children, who had learned to build from Ruth Calloway and who had been keeping a notebook since she was 14 years old. Lily Hadley never stopped digging. And in the valley below the mountains, in a town that had come very close to a different kind of ending, the name Pruitt was spoken the way it deserved to be spoken, with the weight that belongs to people who did the right thing before anyone was watching and who built something that held long after they were gone.